Hey, Sarah, we are so happy to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, where do you live in the world?
I live in Georgia, just about an hour north of Atlanta, but my kids are in virtual school and my husband and I are doing virtual work. So we're in Maryland right now at my parents' house and just kind of enjoying the last few weeks of summer and before we head back. So
Oh
kind of
my, you're
nomads right
all
now.
virtual. All of you are
Yes,
virtual. That is
we're
so
all
interesting.
virtual.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
really cool. Now, you grew up more in the Maryland area, correct?
I did. Yeah, I grew up in Northern Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C., and everyone in my family is still there. So we try to get up here a couple of times a year, and it feels, familiar and like home, but I don't live here. And it's good. I need to Washington's a tough place to live close by, too.
Yeah. So, tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about your background because there's a reason you lived there growing
Yes.
up. So, tell us why you did.
Yeah. So I come from a very political family. Both of my parents were very involved in politics. My dad still is. They met in Washington right out of college, working at the Republican National Committee. They're like a political fairy tale. They got married, and my dad, and my mom still worked for a congressman up until my brother was born. And my dad worked for the Reagan campaign and then in the Reagan administration as Undersecretary of Education and then Chief Domestic Policy Advisor to the president. So most of my growing up years, we were very much involved kind of in the political insiders lane, but not in the spotlight enough to kind of get any of the negative sides to politics. But then my senior year of high school, my dad in 1999 threw his hat into the Republican nomination for president himself. So this was right before the 2000 election. And he ran for the primary alongside, obviously, George W. Bush, who got the nomination, and several others. And so that was kind of an introduction to the less nice side of politics in some ways, and kind of got to see a side that not everybody gets to experience. And so that kind of changed my perspective a little bit on how politics tends to be done.
So tell us about that
Yeah.
perspective change, because it sounds like
Yeah.
it went from maybe positive to more negative.
Yes, it was positive. Growing up, like I said, with my dad's involvement, we were able to go to like inaugurations and go visit the White House and like, what's not to love? This is great. But then when he ran, Washington's a very tribal city. It's, very much, there's the Republicans and there's the Democrats. There's a good versus bad, depending on whatever side you're on. But the interesting thing about primary season is it's Republicans against Republicans or Democrats against Democrats. And so it's kind of like all the conflict is in-house, and it's people that you would, under any other circumstances, consider on your team or on your side. Now you're battling it out with each other. And so it was a very kind of isolating feeling because you're starting to really pick out these small differences and making enemies out of people that you wouldn't normally. So that was a very isolating feeling. The other thing that kind of was a challenge for my family, you realize how little control you have over the narrative that's being spun about who you are and your family. Obviously I didn't experience that as much as my dad did, but I just remember, the media could pick any one soundbite or any one issue in particular, and they could spin something out of it. And not necessarily to the fault of the media, but just out of the fault of just being a public figure. You think you get an idea of what somebody is like based on one quote or one position that they hold. And, in the culture we live in, it's so easy to make our public figures into products, right? That we rate, we give like a 5-star rating to or less, depending on what they're doing for us or how we see them. And you forget that there's these real human beings behind them. And the thing that I wish that people understood about my family was, yeah, you might not like my dad's opinion on foreign policy, but you didn't understand what he was like on a Saturday morning cooking pancakes for us at home, that there was so much more to him as a human, and there was so much more to our family that you would never know. And so that experience, it was not fantastic for me personally, but I think it helped me kind of see politicians from then on, any election cycle, as saying, okay, there's the perception of them on the screen, and then there's the reality. They go home to a family. They come from a family. They grew up as little kids. They had dreams. They had fears. There's so much more to them than we could possibly understand just by reading something about them or watching a clip.
Are you allowed to say your dad's name on
Yes,
air?
he was Gary Bauer. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. I just know people will be curious about that.
Yeah.
We are doing this interview, interestingly, the day after the debate last night. And I think for the world, everyone's watching and saying, wow, that was something else. And feeling everyone, I think across the board is just feeling really discouraged and just very undone by the political climate right now. What do you attribute some of that to? I mean, why are we in this place where discussion is really almost not even possible anymore between two presidential candidates?
Well, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that our leaders are not going to lead out in how to do this. And so it really is, the responsibility is going to be on us as citizens to figure out how to do this with each other if we can't look to our politicians and leaders to do it for us. I think there's probably a lot of reasons that contribute to that. I think divisions have always been a part of who we are and what we, stand for as a country. We're allowed to have dissent. That's okay. But I think what's really changed for us is, probably the normal foe that we look at is social media. Social media has really contributed to the way that we see other people and other sides. And I don't know if you guys have seen that documentary, The Social Dilemma, but it goes deeply into this idea that we are products of, or victims of, depending on how you look at it, these algorithms, and that we start to create these echo chambers that we're living in, getting the feeling that we are getting an unbiased news reporting or unbiased articles, but that we're not. We are products of advertising. We are clicking on articles that are there to entertain us and to buy our attention and to keep our attention, and we're falling into it. And I think what it's doing is it's giving us the impression that we are unbiased and we are critical thinkers, but we're not. We are led by our emotions. And as soon as we encounter someone who has a different idea from us, we think, how could they possibly think that? I'm the one that's thinking correctly because of everything that I've come across and everything that I've seen. And we have no way of understanding that they too are a product of the echo chamber that they came from. So, as much as I love the fact that we have so many different sources we can get our news from, I think it's a little disturbing that we can find a news source that will tell us exactly what we want to hear, that will spin the narrative exactly the way we want it spun. And I think that takes away our critical thinking muscle of being able to engage each other and ask questions that aren't just attacking or aren't just aggressive or aren't defensive of our positions, but we aren't able to just have a genuine curiosity of how we feel about each other and how we landed where we did with our experiences and our beliefs.
Yeah, even just this morning, my husband asked me, so are you seeing anyone who's thinking X? Because we were kind of getting one narrative as far as how that first debate went last night. Yeah. And I said, I can't tell because my echo chamber, I know that I have my own self-created echo chamber. And I said, my confirmation bias is strong here on Twitter. Yeah. Like I follow people who think like me, who come to the same conclusions I do, who tend to have the same worldview I do. Yeah. And I realized that after the first election. I didn't know that I had that until the first election happened. And I thought, wow, I really didn't have a pulse on the country in a way that I thought I did. Right. And so just even that self-awareness to know, I really try to follow people with different ideas, different belief systems who come to different conclusions than I do. But the truth is, I still, no matter how hard I try, have a self-created echo chamber. And that does make it difficult to be able to get into the mind of somebody. And that's where I think real life people can help us. Yes. Because 100%. Then we can ask face to face, so why did you come to that conclusion? Right. Or why do you support this party or this candidate? Yeah. And to do it with that genuine curiosity is key.
Yeah, but I think what you're saying, you're exactly right. The self-awareness is a huge piece. As soon as we're able to say, oh my gosh, I'm a product of the things that I click on. Like, that's okay. We can start to make decisions to remove ourselves from it. I try to have one social media platform where I am intentionally following people that are going to disagree with me, or I'm not necessarily going to agree with their opinions, just to expose myself to it. Or if any time that there's a national event, I try to switch between two different news networks to see how it's being covered, just so I know, even if I think this is the only way that this could be interpreted or explained, there is a whole segment of the population, and it's not fringe. There's a huge population or a huge segment of the population that thinks differently, and it's not helpful to deny that exists or to keep ourselves away from it. It's helpful to know what they're thinking, because we can't have an engaging and a healthy dialogue unless we are first exposed to what those ideas are.
I've got a question about just this whole idea that, as Christians, we have a belief system, and how that plays out may be unique for each one of us, but we have this strong belief system that is rooted in something beyond us.
Yeah.
And so often that puts us at odds with the world from the start, right? Because our belief system is just different. It is. And we're definitely experiencing the world differently because of our lens of faith.
Yeah.
How do we hold on and stay rooted in those beliefs, and at the same time pursue unity with those around us? Because I feel like as the divide gets bigger, you feel more and more like a stranger in the land. You know what I'm saying? You feel more and more like, wow, I feel like I'm a little bit an island over here because, I'm not moving with culture in the same way. So do you have any recommendations for us on that?
Yeah, I think that we first probably need to determine the difference between unity and sameness. I think sometimes we confuse the two, that we need to all be the same as followers of Jesus. But, unity is really saying we have a unity in what we're aiming for, and that we have a common goal, but we're not necessarily on the same page for how we think that needs to be accomplished. So I think it's important to remember that God has called us to unity as followers of Jesus, and not necessarily called us to unity with people who aren't followers of Jesus, but as much as it is possible to live at peace, right, with the people who are around us. And sometimes that's not possible. I think unity really does require two parties to be willing to move toward each other. If it's just one party doing it, it's not a move toward unity, but it is a move towards love. And so I think that is the one thing that we can do, regardless of whether the other person or the other party is willing to engage with us. If they're not interested in pursuing unity, we can be interested in showing them love regardless. But I think the unity piece comes in when you've got two groups of people or two relationships, whatever it is, that are interested in finding common ground. And I think for believers, it really is saying we are united as followers of Jesus. Like, that keeps us connected. We have that in common. And I think when we realize that about each other, that we have this as kind of the lowest common denominator, the thing that connects us above all else, I think it allows us to see our differences in a different light, because we're saying at the end of the day, we are still brothers and sisters in Christ. Like, we hold this in common. I can't understand how you landed where you did, but I have to believe and I have to trust that you are following Jesus in the best way that you know how. And even if you're different from me in some ways, that's a greater exposure for me to what God is like, because you're showing me an aspect of God that I wouldn't know about just from knowing people just like me. I'm seeing something in God, about God in you, that I would not have otherwise engaged. So I think it's a call to make ourselves uncomfortable in some ways. But ultimately it's the love piece. You can't get around that as followers of Jesus. If we can't have unity, then we know that we can move towards one another and how we love one another.
Yeah. So I want to hear a little more about maybe an experience you've had. Can you tell us like what that actually looks like? What does it look like with people who are right in front of you? Emotions are a little high, because I feel like politics sets people on fire. Like, the subject alone, people get so worked up personally. And so it's so hard to separate emotion.
Yeah.
So maybe it would be helpful for you to give an example of how that has manifested in a relationship that you have.
Well, I'll give one example that was, I wrote a little bit about this in the book. My dad, obviously was a public figure, and I came across his name in a book I was reading a couple of years ago that was written from a more liberal political angle and a more liberal theological angle. And it was referencing my dad to a kind of theology that they said he held that was not true. I mean, it was a harmful theology, and it was not at all what he believes. And I was very upset about it and decided to track him down, not on social media, but contact the publisher, get an email, emotionally vomit an email, then edit it out, get it all straight. And I sent this email to this author saying, hey, I just need you to know you're writing about my dad. What you said about him is not true. And you need to know that I don't really agree with everything my dad thinks anymore, that, we've changed in how I think some ways and how he thinks, but you need to know that he's a good man, and that at the end of the day, we still find a way to come together as a family. And I expected that to kind of be the end of the conversation with him. And literally within an hour, this author emailed me back, profusely apologized. And then he said, I would be curious to hear more about your dad and your relationship. And he said, I lean left. I'm theologically liberal, politically liberal. He's a pacifist, actually. And he said he has a grown son who was rebelling against him and joining the military. And he said, I'm trying to figure out how to relate to my son in this way. And I just thought, all of a sudden, all of the differences that we had, all the things I could have accused him for not doing his research enough on my dad, or for what it did to his reputation, for associating him with this theology, and him, accusing me of not being kind enough in my email, or, whatever it was, all of the defenses came down, and we were two people talking about trying to stay connected to our family. And that to me was such a difference maker for us, because I think when we get so heated on our politics, we are only seeing people as the sum total of their political decisions. But we've got to remember that there's a human being behind them. And so then I saw this guy, we became friends on Facebook. Now I see his pictures of his granddaughter that he's posting, and how much he's trying to stay connected to her, even though the relationship with his son, there's a lot of tension, and all the movement that he's trying to do as a dad and a grandfather. And he's seeing the same things with me. So I think that's one way to do it. We remember the humanity in everybody. But when it comes to our family and our friends, we just have to remember that there is more that connected us in the first place than our political beliefs. And like I kind of alluded to, my dad and I don't agree on everything anymore. And we do get in heated arguments and debates. And it isn't always comfortable around the dinner table when we get together and we talk. But at the end of the day, there are things that connect us that are bigger than our political beliefs. And we have to rely on those, that we are not just our political positions. We're bigger than that. And we have a curiosity toward one another and how we arrived at the positions we did, and not an assumption that one of us has it figured out and the other one's lost the plot. I think that helps too.
Yeah. And it sounds like it's kind of a mutual thing for you and your dad. And I would think for a lot of listeners, they may be in a position where they're really trying to create that bridge, that peaceful element, that bigger picture thinking with someone who maybe isn't as interested in that reciprocity. And that's where our faith really has to kick in, and for us to remember that people are made in God's image, and we know their value, and we also know our own value apart from our political beliefs, so that we can separate that and say, my identity is in Christ. I know I may be connected to a political party, I may not be, but that alone is not my identity. My identity is bigger. And that's what you're talking about, is being able to see that bigger identity in other people. And when it's one-sided, as far as the dynamic, we have to trust the Holy Spirit to guide us in that, I would think.
That's right. Yeah. And I think it does go back to that passage that Paul says, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with people. But that is such a pass in a way, right? There's only so much we can do. We are not responsible for changing somebody's mind. We are not responsible for how somebody receives us. We are responsible for doing the best that we can to love as well as we can, and to move in their direction in terms of understanding, and not endorsing what they believe necessarily, or trying to control what they think, but to understand how they got there. And if we can't land on the same page, then that's fine, but I can do my part in loving and accepting who you are as a child of God.
So what is your take on people who just decide, you know what, I'm just not talking politics with people, especially people I don't agree with. Like maybe I'll talk to politics with someone who thinks the same way I do, but maybe I'm just not going to talk about it at all with people because it's not worth the relationship. Do you think that's okay? Do you think it's a cop out? I mean, what do you think?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. And I think anybody who does feel like it's too hard to talk about, I get it. I totally get it. I think that probably I would have opted out of it a long time ago if my entire family hadn't gone into politics, because we don't have a choice. We have to talk about it at the dinner table. But I do think probably our lack of talking about it, that whole, we don't talk about politics and religion in polite company thing. I think that's probably contributed to where we are right now, because I think civil discourse and civil dialogue is a muscle. And when you don't use it, it atrophies. It's not like riding a bike where you just pick it right back up again. And I think without practice, that's what's gotten us here. We don't know how to talk about it. And so I think a lot of us have kind of adapted this mentality of keeping the peace instead of making peace. So we keep the peace by kind of pretending that there's nothing going on, there's no really big problem, or just, we're kind of glossing over all the issues. Making peace instead instead is figuring out, okay, we might not have everything in common. We might not have a whole lot in common, but where can we agree? Where can we be on the same page? And so for my family, we talk about it. We don't land on the same page, but at the end of the day, they will tell me, we want the best country for our grandchildren. And I can tell them, I want the best country for my children. So we're that's the same goal. That's what we're unified in. How we get there is different. But when we can be generous in the motives that we assign one another, I think that helps in not having such a heated argument. But my advice would be to keep trying, to keep going towards having the conversations. I don't think we'll get better by not doing it, by continuing to avoid it. I think we have a responsibility to have hard conversations, even though it's challenging, even though it leaves us a sweaty mess at the end. I think it's still worth doing in some form or fashion.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some discernment there too with who.
I think so too.
Right? Because
I think so. Yeah.
If someone's not a believer and they're not coming for unity, in fact, they're coming against you in a way that's hard and aggressive.
Yeah.
Maybe that isn't the best place to engage, right?
Yeah, and I think it's important too when we talk about racial issues. And I think that there are people, if you are a person of color and you're trying to have a conversation with somebody who is a racist, there's things for your mental health you should not be engaging in. And I think that that's important to know too. We need to know where are we in a place where are we able to have these conversations where they're good for us and they don't leave us feeling emotionally and spiritually depleted at the end. I think we need to know our boundaries and how to go about doing that well. I just think we don't want to just assume just because the conversation is hard that we shouldn't have it. So I think there's a balance there, and only we can know, what we should be doing and how we should be engaging that.
Can I give an example of my life in the last week?
Yes.
A friend of mine who is a friend from the neighborhood who knows that I personally am a pro-life person, that I've written about that. She posted something on Facebook about her disappointment in the pro-lifers' response to Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing. And again, I live in an echo chamber and I tend to be surrounded by people who think like me. And my echo chamber tends to be on the pro-life end of the spectrum and also tended to really celebrate Ruth, Justice Ginsburg. And so I just thought, I have some insight here that I can offer, because I have heard a lot of pro-life people really celebrating what she did for women. Yeah. And did I see some nasty comments? Yeah, I saw a few, but generally people really kind of redirected the conversation. And so I made a comment on her post on Facebook, and I had considered, should I do this privately? Yeah. But I'm not really calling her out directly. It was more the thinking that all pro-life people have a similar response. And I wanted other people who were reading this post to see my comment as well. Yeah. So I decided to make it a public comment. And I was I took a lot of time in how I responded. I was a very intentional, and I didn't attack her. I said, my biggest concern is with that first sentence, that there was a single pro-life response, because there wasn't, there never is. And this, let me tell you what I have heard over the last week. And it wasn't just me. Like I was saying, I have ears to hear maybe other people that you don't. Right. And she responded in the best way I could have asked for. She said, "You're right. I don't want to be promoting labels. This just puts people in a silo. I do need to recognize that there are different responses." And so that was a moment in my life where I thought, do I enter this or do I not? Yeah. And I thought, I am the right person, because I don't know that she has a lot of people in her life. And she did even say in her response, "I always think that you're very thoughtful." And so I knew that she trusted that I wasn't just boom, emotionally responding. Yeah. Now I definitely had emotion in it. Right. But that moment of saying, am I the right person for right now to respond to this? Right. What is the kindest way to do it? And what is my goal in responding? That's right. And so I went through all of those questions. So I just thought that could be an example of something that's timely, that was political, but also personal for me, within social media that ended well.
Yeah.
And part of it was to that question of, is this the right person for me to be responding to? Because I know that we have a trusted relationship, and we already know that we don't see eye to eye on this particular topic, but she respects me. And so it was right, and it was a correct thing to do.
Well, I think the fact that you're even asking the question, is this the right, am I the person to do this? Should I put this on social media? Is this better as a conversation? That to me tells me that you're not reacting. It's not just, you're not emotional reaction right there. It's a very thought out, responsive thing. I think we just need more of that. It's not saying we shouldn't be engaging online or in social media platforms. It's just saying, are we doing it in a way that's going to move the conversation forward and move the relationship forward? Because people who see that, I think that's such an encouragement to them to know that it's possible to have people who disagree on a fundamental issue still be able to have a healthy discourse, and her willingness to hear it, you know, your willingness to say it in a kind way and her willingness to own it right away. I mean, that's like, you never see that on social media. So the fact that it exists out there for people to see it, I think is a huge win. It tells me that it's not a lost cause, that we can do this.
Right. And I wanted to model that for my community.
Sure. Yeah.
So good.
I love that.
Yeah, me too.
That.
So Sarah, can you talk us through how to lead our families through political topics?
Yeah.
I mean, that's hard too, right? And we're talking about this idea of siloing. I mean, that's, you know, that we're all in our little silos and we're going to raise little mini silos, you know, and you know what I'm saying? Like, we do tend to talk about things around the dinner table from our perspective. And, you know, part of that as Christians is we're trying to pass on this legacy of faith. And so that is a part of it. And for me, very central. And yet at the same time, I don't want to pass on this like siloed mentality. So can you help us with even how we do this at our tables?
Yeah, I think the fact that we're even trying to talk about it at our tables is a win. One of the reasons I wrote this book and started writing it when I did was my kids are starting to become an age where they were paying more and more attention to the political dialogue around them, not just on the ads on television or the bumper stickers, but to what was being talked about in our extended family, and asking questions about why one side of the family thought this and we thought this, and paying attention. And I thought, I didn't want them to think that what they were seeing play out on television was the only way that we could have these political conversations. I wanted them to know that there was a better way, but if I wasn't part of the solution, that I was complicit in the problem. And so it made me feel like I've got to start modeling this with my own kids and talking about the things that I believe strongly in with my family, and how it doesn't always line up with them, but that's not going to discount the relationship that we have with them. So I think the most important thing to do is to remember that what connects us first, right? Like I said earlier with our relationships, we're family first. We cannot let anything get in the way of that. And the thing that my parents did so well for me as I started to kind of change and what I thought and some ideas, and was able to talk to them about it, is they modeled consistent acceptance and belonging in a safe place to talk about it. And that did not mean that they agreed with everything that I ended up saying, but there was never a question that our relationship was on the line because of something I started to think or decided to believe. And I just thought, as parents, that is the best thing that we can offer our kids, is a safe place for them to come back to, and to really kind of test out some of their ideas as they're starting to think on their own and think more critically, and to engage that muscle. I think as parents, you know, we want to put them on a path and teach them and guide them. But at the end of the day, more than what to think, we want to teach them how to think and how to make these decisions in a better way. And for me, you know, so I'm parenting my kids aware that they could very much grow up and think differently than I do, right? Just like I ended up doing in some ways from my family. And so I think one of the things I want to make sure I see with them and do with them is what my family did for me. And that was, nobody was coming from this as a position of superiority. They weren't looking at me as kind of like I caved into culture. I was looking to them like they, you know, were less evolved than I was, that there wasn't this sense of demeaning or condescending, or one of these days you'll come around to thinking like I do. It was kind of more an appreciation for the experiences that each one of us had that shaped us to make us who we were. And I think as adult children to our parents, it's really important to model respect for the place that we came from. I don't ever want my parents to think that I think less of them because of the beliefs that they hold. And I don't want my kids to see me treating my parents that way. So there's so many different dynamics involved in all this, but a mutual respect is so important at preserving the relationship. That, I think, is what's going to keep us tied together, even if our beliefs change along the way. But teaching our kids how to mutually respect while disagreeing with one another, that is going to take them far, not just in our families, but in how they do life in the real world and in the working world, their future relationships. Like, that's just a really powerful tool.
Mm-hmm. Those are all great guiding principles. I would love to hear as well, like even how you bring up political topics at your table. Do you teach kind of these different viewpoints? Okay, here's where these people are coming from. Here's where these people are coming from. What do you think? I mean, even practically, how do you do that as a family?
Yeah. So with my kids, they're 8 and 10. So what we're talking about around our dinner table is more like, there's a presidential debate on tonight. These are the people who are going to be talking. These are the things that are most likely to come up. This is why this matters. That if the news is on, which the news tends to be on when we're around my family, my parents, there's headlines coming across the bottom of the screen. So they're asking questions. What does this mean? Tell me what a Supreme Court justice is, all these kinds of questions, and why these are bigger ideas. And the thing that I think has been helpful is pulling from the current events allows us to introduce the nuance that needs to be around some of these topics, and talking and paying attention to some of the headlines that are coming across and saying, okay, they're making it sound like it's this. There's more to it than that. Here's what else is going on. I think our kids are very concrete thinkers. So they're going to tend to think in right and wrong, good and bad, and that type of thing, the younger kids especially. But introducing that there are other sides and there are other perspectives is always super helpful. With my family, my brother and sister and my dad, they're still so much involved in politics. It really is just pulling out any kind of cultural or current event and just saying, so tell me about this. And we could go for hours just hearing from each other in that way. But I think it's important to remember on some of the issues, what is worth a conversation and what's not worth your emotional investment. So there are things that are worth talking about, and there are ideas that are worth bringing up with our younger kids. And there's some things like, it's not time for that yet. You don't need to know all the specifics, and just kind of introducing ideas gradually, knowing it's like an ongoing conversation. This is not a one-time thing of this is the right side, this is the wrong side, but this is kind of where we are right now. And we're still trying to figure it out as your parents, and it's complicated, and that's okay.
What do you say to people who are just, I hear some people say, you know what, ultimately this isn't our home, Christians. Ultimately, this isn't our home anyway. So why should we even care about politics? Why should we even, fully engage in this when, you know what, we're not supposed to, fully plant here anyway.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that? What is your opinion on that?
Yeah. I don't blame anybody who thinks that, because it's overwhelming when we look at the condition of the world and to think how in the world are we supposed to make this the way God designed it to look or dreamed for it to look. So I don't fault anybody for thinking that. But when I think about what Jesus talked about and how he talks about the kingdom of heaven, he said over and over again that the kingdom of heaven is here and it's now, and we have to have the eyes to see it. And very rarely did he talk about some far off place that we were going to. It was what was happening right here and right now. And so I think as Christians, we have a responsibility of trying to bring the kingdom of God here the best way that we can. On the other hand, I think there's probably a segment of Christians who think that the best way to bring the kingdom of heaven here is only through politics and legislation and policy. And on that end, I would say that's not all it is either. I think in some ways it's easier to cast a vote and to say, I did my part and that's it. Or I participated in a protest and that was it. I think the harder part of bringing the kingdom of heaven here and what we're asked to do is to be involved in the painstaking, slow work of relationships. It's connecting with one another over and over and over again. That's with gentleness and compassion and love. Like, that's how we bring the kingdom here. And yes, vote and do that. That's important. But it's both and. We can't be living like it's one or the other.
And that makes me think too that our political views really are kind of up here in the big picture, but it's how we live our daily lives that we are living out those political principles.
That's right.
That we so strongly defend. So
Yes.
how are we in our everyday experiences modeling to our kids, for example, I am living this out because I claim to believe this. And really, again, that gets to our faith. And I just want to say, talking about our older kids and political conversations, we have some lively ones at our house. And it has been, for my older kids, a really great way for us to talk about our faith. Because everything comes back to God says this about people, and because we love people, and because we love God, this is where we're landing on this particular issue. The issues aren't just in a vacuum for us as believers, that this is how our faith informs where we get to this particular conclusion. And then how are we living that out? Because for kids to hear parents make big faith statements or big political statements and not have a life that reflects what they believe or how they're voting, I think that is where the modeling and the hypocrisy is blatant. And the teenager will call you out when you aren't living by what you say you believe. And so I don't want to say that my political beliefs are at the same level as my faith beliefs, because I think my faith informs my politics. But my politics only have strength in statements if I'm also living out the principles in my own life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, the greatest commandment is to love God and to love people. I think part of that, part of the problem with our lack of civil discourse is we're not talking about people as though we're actually loving them. And so if our kids are paying attention to the way we're talking about each other in our politics, then they need to see that we believe it and we are living it when we say we are loving somebody. We're not just going to trash other people who think differently than us. We're going to intentionally talk about them in a respectful and honoring way. I think that's huge.
Just this morning, I was reading in the Beth Moore James study, something that I thought you just said something that I thought was so appropriate for this conversation. And she says, true wisdom has a gentleness about it. Harsh people are never wise. They may be smart, they may be right, but they are not what the Bible calls wise. And then she goes on in James 3:17, she says, she quotes scripture, the wisdom from above is first of all pure, then peace-loving, gentle, full of mercy and good fruit, without favoritism and hypocrisy. I mean, does that not just sum up what we just talked about? You know, that like, if we truly want to be wise people in the world when it comes to politics and any other subject, we have to be gentle and we have to be kind, and we can't have hypocrisy, what Alex was just saying. You know, we have to align and not be duplistic. I mean, all of these things, it's so important how we're living, and are we being wise in the way that we are approaching the subject? So good.
And it's countercultural. It doesn't, politics does not model that for us. And we know that that's not necessarily what's going to get engagement online either, right? So it's so countercultural to what we do, but that is what makes our faith fundamentally different. If politics is about a harshness, being the quickest to answer, being the quickest to get an insult in, then our faith is asking us, how can I be the quickest to forgive? How can I be the quickest to honor you, to serve you, to love you in a way that requires something from me and not just you? It's totally opposite.
Well, I like what she said, like that person may be right. They may be smart, but they're not wise, because wisdom holds hands with gentleness. And I was like, whoa, that's good.
Huge.
That's huge.
Really good.
Huge.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, just give us maybe one or two just tips for moving through the election season.
Yeah. Okay. First, I would say approach people with a curiosity and not a sense of shaming. Instead of a question of how could you possibly think like that? How could you vote for that person? A question of, what in your life led you to hold these ideals as highly as you do? Help me understand why you land where you do. So I think curiosity needs to be paramount above everything else in our interactions. I would say don't attend every argument you're invited to. There are some things that are not worth your energy, and deciding what are the topics that you will invest your emotional energy in. that's important, do that, but you don't have to do every one. When you can tell things are getting heated, you can just say, you know what, I'm not really in a place where I want to talk about this right now, and just call it. But I also would say, probably more importantly, I made this mistake in 2016, thinking once the first Tuesday in November passed, everything would go back to normal. I think we need to have the mentality that this is a marathon and not a sprint, and that after Election Day, emotions will not be any less heated than they are now. In fact, they'll probably be worse in some ways. We might not have to watch campaign ads anymore, but we're going to have one group of people who's extremely happy and another group of people who's extremely disappointed. And we're going to be heading into holiday season and having to navigate that. And so I think emotionally, spiritually, mentally, we need to be preparing for the long haul in this, and that there's going to be conversations that we're going to continue to have. We're going to continue to have to pull from our spiritual resources, relying on the Holy Spirit to lead us in that gentleness and compassion and honor and respect, and not just assume that there's a finish line that's right around the corner.
It's really good, Sarah. Those are rock solid for all of us. Yeah. Thank you. Can you tell people what the name of your book is?
Yeah, my book is The Space Between Us, How Jesus Teaches Us to Live Together When Politics and Religion Pull Us Apart.
So great. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for your voice in the world and for coming on today. We've really, really appreciated what you had to say.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care, Sarah.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.